and we'll open it up. And I mean, there's municipalities are a creature of the province, and basically half the budget is driven by the province. So
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Ian, and thanks so much for inviting me to join you. Michael and Nancy, can you hear me okay? Okay, good. I'll do my best to make sure I project. I don't have the loudest voice, which is not always an asset in politics, but if you can't hear me, just, gesture and I'll do my best
You can
to.
always take the microphone a little closer too, if you
Okay,
like.
I'll do my best to project more. So first of all, let me say thank you for the invitation to your spring festival a few weeks ago. That was really lovely. It was an incredible event. It was amazing to see so many people in the street having such a good time. And you got very, very lucky with the weather on the second try. The first one would not have been a welcome spring event. And the second one, I was thinking in the morning, like, oh, I don't know if this is going to happen. And then it was like spring broke through all of a sudden, right in time for your event. So that was really amazing to see. So it's now 10 months since I was elected, and it's been quite the year. During much of the pandemic, we saw a bit of a different Doug Ford, one who was, some of his privatization instincts were reined in a bit, and some of his destructive agenda had to be put to the side while they focused on pandemic relief. There were still some trends there, sitting on a lot of money from the federal government and using it for license plate rebates and tax cuts instead of actually using it for the COVID protection purposes. But what we've seen since last June is really a government that feels empowered, like they don't need to listen to anybody. And so it's been full steam ahead with an agenda of trying to remake Ontario as their own private fiefdom. There's no better example of that than healthcare. And during the election last year, around Ottawa, West Nepean, there were two issues that I'd heard from everybody that were top of mind. One was healthcare and one was affordability. And unfortunately, both of them are worse today than they were last year. With healthcare, we've really seen the effects of decades of underfunding of the hospital system combined with the effects of the pandemic, but also Bill 124, which capped the wages of nurses and healthcare workers coming home to roost. So healthcare workers and nurses have been leaving the profession in large numbers because they're burnt out and they feel disrespected. And so we have beds and operating rooms that aren't being used because there's no healthcare workers to staff them. And having an operating room without a nurse is actually quite useless. And so we have these incredibly long wait times. If you go to the ER, I keep telling my kids when they horseplay, don't do that. I don't have time to take you to the hospital right now. And they're always like, oh, Mom, you take me to the hospital. I'm like, no, literally, I don't have time to take you to the hospital because we'll be there till tomorrow. There's wait times in some cases of 18 to 24 hours. And then there's the wait times for surgeries, which are taking an incredibly long time. And for some people exceeding the amount of time that's recommended for their condition. And so people are, I think, quite rightfully incredibly frustrated, and they are demanding solutions. And what we are seeing is that instead of actually investing in our public healthcare system and providing the resources that we need to make it function well, the Ford government has been expanding privatization within the system, creating a parallel privatized system that will operate alongside the public system. And when people said, well, this is going to be really bad for the public system because it's going to pull workers out of the public system, the government said, no, it's okay, don't worry, because we're going to say that they have to have a staffing plan for the private facilities, so they won't be able to take public workers. But we already see there's a private clinic operating in Ottawa out of the Riverside Hospital, run by a private consortium, and they are stealing Ottawa hospital nurses to work their shifts. And the Ottawa hospital is short nurses, including some patients had their cancer care canceled because those nurses were no longer available to work in the publicly funded system. And so we have a serious fight ahead of us to make sure that we protect the publicly funded system and ensure that everybody gets healthcare through that system, and to not allow them to double down on this expansion of privatization. The Ontario Health Coalition will be running a referendum in May. They're actually looking at using the Collingwood Library as one of their referendum sites, but they're hoping that 1 million people across Ontario will come out and vote no to privatization to send a message to Doug Ford that this is not what Ontarians want. That might be what the wealthy companies that are lobbying Doug Ford and Sylvia Jones, what they want. But most people want to be able to get healthcare without paying out of pocket. And we know that these private clinics, as much as Doug Ford says you can pay with your OHIP card when you go, that's not how it works. They charge fees for all kinds of things. There's upselling. The Auditor General has said that upselling is already happening in clinics, even though it's not supposed to. And then it takes nurses and healthcare workers out of the public system. So people with more complicated cases, people with cases that can't be dealt with in the private system, end up waiting far longer within the public system. So that's an incredibly important fight that's been going on. At the same time, one thing I hear from a lot of people in Ottawa, West Nepean, is that they don't have a family doctor, or they're about to lose their family doctor. And there has been no kind of effort to find a solution to help people maintain a family doctor, to make it easier for family doctors to stay in practice, but also to invest in the kinds of community care options that would ease the caseload for family doctors. So community health centers and nurse practitioners and things where, you can go and get a prescription that's not from a private pharmacist at Shoppers Drug Mart, but is from a publicly funded clinic within your community. Sounds like there was just very narrowly an accident avoided there. Okay.
It's an accident waiting to happen.
All right. You got to have Teresa here for a meeting some night.
She knows how bad it is. Someone a long time ago decided that we weren't going to align Woodruff North with Woodruff South. And so this is the consequence. It was a choice.
Yeah.
And we're gonna put a bunch more condos all around it.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yes.
So lots more people driving here.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We need about 40,000 more people in this neighborhood to ensure that it's more viable.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry.
So the second issue that I've heard a lot about over the past year is affordability and cost of living. And again, it's one that has really only gotten worse. The cost of groceries and hydro is definitely more expensive now than it was a year ago. But the biggest category within cost of living is definitely housing. And it's all kinds of housing. It's single family homes that people want to buy, but it's also apartments and rental housing. It's lack of community or social housing. There just are not options for people, and people are quite frequently not secure in the housing that they have. And what we've seen is that the Conservatives have run roughshod over municipalities and over our green spaces, saying that what we need to do is give developers free rein in order to build enough housing that we can bring down the price of housing. Never mind the fact that developers aren't actually interested in building the kind of affordable rental housing that would actually ease the pressure on the market. But some of their decisions are actually making the situation worse for everyone, regardless of the kind of housing that you want to buy. So for instance, Bill 23, which they rammed through last year, takes away developer fees for what they call affordable housing, but really it's based on market rent. So it's not at all, it's completely not affordable, but it allows developers to get out of paying fees. But that's taking a huge chunk of money out of the city of Ottawa's coffers, which means that the city of Ottawa both has to increase property taxes or decrease services in order to make up for that shortfall. And we're seeing municipalities saying no to the development of new housing because now they can't afford to provide the infrastructure around that those new housing developments because of the loss of money. So we're actually seeing fewer homes being built because of Bill 23 being rammed through. So what we actually need is policies that will provide genuine incentives for municipalities, not-for-profit housing developers, for the province to play a role in developing the kind of deeply affordable housing that will ease the pressure on the market and allow people at the lower income end of the spectrum to find reasonable and affordable housing and take some of the pressure off the housing sales market. We do need to be building more homes as well, but we also need to do that in an ecologically conscious way instead of paving over farmland and wetlands. here in Ottawa, we have a few examples of why you should not pave over wetlands, because sooner or later the water comes back. And there's some real concerns about how that legislation absolves developers of responsibility when they build on ecologically sensitive land. So you could buy a home thinking it's affordable and it's on wetland, and the eventual flooding that will take place will actually be your problem. But we're seeing challenges across the spectrum with cost of living. I'm hearing from lots of people the inability to buy nutritious food anymore. The demand on our food banks has never been this high. They're telling me they're seeing people who were able to get back on their feet 4 or 5 years ago coming back. And it's not because they've lost their jobs. It's because their jobs are no longer allowing them to pay for food. And so they have to turn back to the food bank. But the problem is the government also killed the social services relief funding that was provided to municipalities during the pandemic. And so there's less money going to resources like the food bank, to Meals on Wheels, to community meal programs, the Ottawa Food Partnership, and all of these different programs within our community that actually provided support to people in need. And so they are less able to meet the demand, even as the demand is rising. And we're seeing a similar thing. The Ministry of Health refused to give an increase in funding to community social service organizations in Eastern Ontario. That includes Meals on Wheels and includes the Old Forge in our riding, which provides supports to seniors, including a grocery bus. They take them grocery shopping, dementia day programs, healthcare programs, all kinds of programs that help seniors to live and people with disabilities healthy and independent lives, so that they don't need to end up in a hospital bed or in a long-term care facility where the taxpayer ends up paying for a very high level of care, when a very little level of preventative care actually helps people to stay independent and at home. And they refuse to provide them with the funding increase. And so these organizations in our community have had to cut their services back at a time when demand is really high. So that has been incredibly frustrating, and it's something that I have been fighting for alongside my colleagues. So those were the two priorities that I heard across the riding last year. There's a couple other things that I've been working on. One is definitely climate change and emergency response. So we do not have very long to prevent catastrophic levels of climate change, but you all know, as fellow residents of Ottawa West Nepean, that we're already seeing the effects here in Ottawa West Nepean. The 2 once-in-a-century floods in the space of 6 years, the derecho, the April ice storm, followed by the April 30-degree weather, which I didn't mind the 30-degree weather, just to be clear, but the ice storm, that's the second time in less than a year that we had a multi-day power outage, and that causes real hardships and difficulties for members of our community. One of the aspects that I have been fighting on is people who live in apartment buildings and condo buildings without a generator, because people with disabilities or seniors or people with mobility issues like parents of young children, when the power goes out and the elevator's not running, they're trapped, but it also knocks out the water pump. So you are trapped without food or water in your home. And some of these people are medically vulnerable, so they need medical care, but home care also can't go up if you have to take the stairs, and you can't get down to see a doctor. So it's like a recipe for disaster. And having canvassed in many of the buildings in our neighborhood that did not have power after the derecho last year, I'm kind of amazed that nobody has died yet. So I tabled a private members bill that called for the mandatory installation of generators, because there's many buildings that have a generator. It's not happening to every building, but unfortunately the Conservatives voted against it. So I cannot retable this bill unless they prorogue and there's a new throne speech. But if that happens, then I will, and otherwise, next election. But this is a fight that only stops when we protected everyone's rights. But the outage 2 weeks ago is also like a wake-up call that we need to be doing more to build resilient infrastructure across our neighborhoods. It was really disheartening to see the Hydro Ottawa map over the course of the 4 days. The first day it was all Ottawa that was red. And then every day it kind of like shrunk down until it was just Ottawa, West Nepean. And it's like, why are we bright red when they've managed to solve it everywhere else? And I know Teresa Kavanaugh and Sean Devine and Lane Johnson are also interested in having that conversation. And so I'm reaching out to Hydro Ottawa, having conversations with city councilors about what can be done and what's the province's role in making sure that we build that resilient infrastructure. You know, I'm definitely interested in measures to retrofit homes and reduce our energy demands, but we also need to be finding ways to protect against the effects of climate change that is baked in. And so emergency response is part of that. And then education has been a huge part of my workload for the past 10 months, because in the fall we had the situation with the CUPE workers, with the government refusing to negotiate and things coming to a head. And now this week we've had this education bill tabled along with the funding situation at the same time. So let me give a little bit of context first. The Conservative government has been providing less funding for education every year. So next year it will be $1,200 less per student in Ontario once you've accounted for inflation compared to 2018. So a significant drop in funding at the same time that the needs among kids have never been higher because of the years of disruption. So we are seeing across the riding and across the province, very crowded classrooms, like classrooms of 35 or 37 kids with kids elbow to elbow, multiple kids with an IEP in the class, but there's no EA. And so the teacher is on their own to try to manage that number of kids and provide specialized support to them. There's not enough EAs and teachers, and they're experiencing burnout too, kind of like in the healthcare profession. And so lots of occasions where there's shortages and classes are either being canceled or they have an unqualified person in the class, or kids are just having a movie put on to, you know, look after them during the day, but no learning is happening. There's not enough special education supports. So a lot of kids with disabilities are not getting the supports they need, and parents are being called to come and pick them up, or they're told they can only be at school for a certain number of days or a certain number of hours per week. And then a huge mental health crisis. 90% of principals in Ontario said their school needed more mental health resources than what they have. And in fact, half of schools have no mental health resources at all. But, you know, the mental health crisis is great enough that we're seeing a rise in violence with kids acting out because they're not getting the help that they need, and there's not enough teachers and education workers to be able to like step in and resolve the situation quickly. Plus there's, you know, when kids lash out, teachers and education workers can be on the receiving end of that. So I spoke to some teachers last week who are going to school in Kevlar provided by the Ottawa Carleton District School Board. So
Wow.
yeah, this is the situation that we have. So what we really needed to see this week was a greater investment in our schools to bring down those class sizes, to be able to hire more teachers and education workers, to make sure that we have the special education supports, and then at least one mental health professional for every school. But instead of doing that, Stephen Lecce, the Minister of Education, tabled a funding announcement that only increases funding by 0.8%. And inflation, remember, is at 5% right now. So it's significantly below the rate of inflation. And at the same time that he did that, I was telling Ian at the beginning, he made the announcement after tabling this education bill. So he went into the legislature, tabled the education bill, came out into the media studio and talked about his bill, and then was like, oh, and by the way, here's the funding for next year. And I believe that was very deliberate on his part, because now everybody is talking about the education bill instead of talking about the funding and the fact that it actually represents a real cut for next year. So the bill will basically micromanage school boards. It allows the minister to impose priorities on them. It requires them to create reports on the minister's priorities and report them in whatever format he asks them to do that. It also allows the minister to compel school boards to sell off schools to any individual he wants at any price he wants. He says that's so that he can force the sale between boards. So like the English Public Board might have a school and the French Public Board might need one, and he can compel the English Public Board to sell to the French Public Board. But if that was all you wanted to do, then in my mind, you would have just put schools in the legislation. You know, the minister can compel the school to sell to another school board. The fact that they put anyone in there certainly raises red flags for a government that has had very cozy relationships with developers, and somehow developers keep getting sweetheart deals for green belts and science centers. So, you know, it is definitely a real concern about what the outcome will be if this bill goes ahead. So we are still at second reading debate, and then it will go to committee. So I'm looking forward to having all the education unions and school board trustees and parent education groups coming in, because none of them were consulted on the bill. So having the opportunity to finally do that consultation with them and hear what they have to say about it, hear what the public has to say, and see if we can get the government to back down on at least some of these changes. But definitely we need to keep up the fight for adequate funding in education, because that's what's actually going to make the difference and actually allow our kids to catch up for the past few years. So I don't know if that was 15 minutes or if I got on a roll and went way longer, but I'm happy to take questions now.
We have one question from one of our participants, Michael. You want me to read your question?
Yeah, go ahead.
We can hear it.
We can hear you now.
Oh, you can hear me now. Okay, then you don't need to read the question.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. Very insightful. It's 30 degrees down here, but I'll be fine. Yeah, there's such a, I mean, we know there's a lot of immigration happening in the country. We know we need housing. I'm not a fan of the way the Conservatives are trying to ram things down people's throats, but the fact is we still need housing. Is there any mechanism in place within your party or other parties to follow up on the city? Because a lot of what I'm hearing in the building community is that the city is now stonewalling everybody. We still need the housing. I mean, whether they want to fight about it or not, we still need the housing.
Right. And when you say the city is stonewalling, is that on the permits?
Basically, a lot of applications are just being deemed incomplete, even when they are.
So the city passed a new official plan,
Mhm.
and then you have to pass the bylaw that implements all the regulations that support that. And they're not there yet. And maybe to their defense, there's, I forget the exact number, 23 points that were added to by the government to the official plan roster. So, you know, so there's a due diligence around what that means. I mean, I think Michael's right. The city just isn't carrying the ball.
Yeah.
It's like they've thrown up their hands, but we still need housing.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I don't know all the ins and outs of the municipal conversation around housing, but what I do know is that the lack of revenues that they lost when Bill 23 went through has hamstrung them, but it's also put a halt on a number of things while they try to get the provincial government to make them whole for that money. And that's something that we have been pushing for. Like, if you're going to take this away, then at least replace the funding with provincial funding, so that, you know, the city is not saying no to new developments because they don't have the funding to put the infrastructure in place, or the city is not investing funds in its own development of affordable and community housing. So that's one thing that we need to see. But definitely, you know, there's very little that I can do as an MPP about what happens at City Hall. The Minister for Municipal Affairs can do quite a bit, as we've seen, because the cities are creatures of the province, and this is a government that's been pretty heavy-handed with the cities. But we really need all levels of government to get back into the business of supporting housing. You know, that's been one of the big lacks over the last 30 years, right? Like, we see the decline in the availability of housing and the increase in prices when the federal and provincial governments got out of housing in the 1990s. And so we need to be supporting all partners, municipalities and not-for-profit organizations to be building housing. And for the province and the federal government to get back into the business of directly building very affordable housing.
Yes, I guess the point is, while all the finger pointing continues, it's the people who suffer.
Absolutely. I hear you on that.
Thank you.
So earlier you're talking about school boards divesting of schools. The way I understood it back in the Stone Ages, that the property went to Ontario Realty Corp. And then they shopped it around like a list of who was allowed access to it, whether it be various public schools or stuff, and municipalities were on that list. And then, and I'm sure it also went through the departments, like,
Mhm.
Does labor need another building or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So I don't understand how the old system allowed for the various school boards to pick it up. And the problem is in our jurisdiction of the greater Ottawa area, the Catholic board doesn't want English schools. Their schools are better than the English system. Like there's no one needs more schools in the core where there's less people.
Yeah.
So I don't, we have a delivery for Richard. So anyways, it's.
Yeah. Well, and again, the minister has been talking in his media comments and in the legislature about how these school buildings, if they're unused or underused, could be used for affordable housing or for long-term care facilities. And again, I don't think there'd be very many people opposed to that. But if that was all your goal was, then why wouldn't you just limit it to, sale to other school boards, use for affordable housing and use for long-term care? It's the fact that he can compel the sale to anyone at any price point that I think is deeply concerning with the government that has shown they're prepared to give developers sweetheart deals.
Right.
What's wondering if you've heard anything, because there's a lot of, within the court, the city court, there's a lot of comment about the developments that have been going on. But they don't seem to be geared towards families, and if they were, then the knock-on effect is the schools would be used more. And we see it in other cities. I mean, Toronto seems to have it, Vancouver's done it very well. European cities, it's their way of life. So is there any sort of news that you know about on that front, better use of the condo system?
No, not at all. And, it's one of the things that I think is dangerous about leaving housing development solely up to private developers, that there's no reason for them to take families into consideration, right? Just like there's no reason for them to take the lower income affordable housing into account. During the debate, the conservatives seem to act like if you just let developers build enough houses, eventually the price would come down. And I was, trying to say, it doesn't matter how many homes you build, it's never going to become affordable to somebody who's getting $730 a month on Ontario Works. Like, just think how many big houses we would have to build before it's being sold at that price. Like, we actually need housing that, yes, is affordable to people at the top end of the spectrum, but is also affordable to people at the bottom end of the spectrum and meets the needs of people at various stages of their life. So, people who live alone, but also families, people who need accessible housing, whether it's because of a disability or because they're a senior. And then, we're starting to see a bit of a return of multi-generational family living situations. So homes that accommodate that. And so that's why I think it's really important that we provide support to the nonprofit and community housing sector as well, because that's where we really see that a housing sector that's focused on human need and how the housing will be used, rather than just how quickly can they get the home up and what will the profit margin be once it's done.
One of the things you didn't talk about, and I agree with all the concerns that you raised, is the people living in shelters and that whole mess, which I think is got worse over COVID, and I think it's resolved. It's probably got worse. Like,
part of the, like, is that another thing that's clearly a city responsibility and then which government's walked away from it? Or-
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's kind of a shared responsibility in that measures that would keep people housed and not homeless are paid for by both province and municipality. It's really the province that has the big policy levers on that one. And so, things like letting ODSP and Ontario Works sit so far below what the rate of rent is. The fact that on minimum wage, it's still really difficult for you to find something that's not 75 to 80% of your income. The fact that there's no rent control on new buildings, and the fact that there's no rent control in between tenants. So what I see and hear a lot of cases of is landlords pushing tenants out for illegitimate reasons because they can charge the next tenant whatever they want. And so that makes people's housing situation incredibly unstable. So that's one reason why we're seeing so many more people who are homeless and, these encampments springing up across the province too. And then the second is the mental health crisis and addictions crisis. And the pandemic really showed how broken our mental health system is. That was actually another thing I saw firsthand knocking on doors across the riding last year was that everybody has a mental health issue, like, low income, high income, professionals, blue collar workers, kids, grownups, like it was across the spectrum. And our mental health care system, there's a tiny bit of mental health care that's publicly funded, but generally only if you're in crisis and need to be admitted to hospital. And then there's a really small amount available for children, but with like a year-long wait list. So most of it is privately delivered and you have to have benefits of some kind in order to be able to afford it. But we also saw that the demand was so high that the amount of healthcare resources we have was not keeping up with the demand anymore. So even people who had benefits were having trouble finding someone to provide that care. And then there's not really good addiction resources available, including supportive housing. So when I met with the Ottawa Alliance to End Homelessness, they told me there's supportive housing units available, but there's no one to staff it. And so it's kind of like a hospital bed, right? That it's without the staff, it's just furniture. It's not actually a supportive housing unit. And so people with mental health crises and addictions are not always getting the support that they need. And so then many of them end up in our shelter system or on our streets.
Well, it's just so sad to see all those people that are more productive members of society.
Yeah, absolutely. Like it really feels like you're seeing social collapse happening around you and the sort of rise in violence and safety incidents that comes along with it. Like, a certain amount of breakdown when we're no longer taking care of one another.
Okay, what's your favorite thing that's happening right now? Like, oh my gosh.
Yeah,
Sorry, say me something good.
Yeah.
I feel like I gotta grab the table.
Yeah.
I apologize. My goal was not to come and say like, feel depressed. Everything is drowning around you. The world is ending. Yeah, exactly. No, I mean, we are winning victories on certain issues. The CUPE strike is a really good example of one where people came together and said, it's not okay that these workers who are so essential to our education system are using food banks and have to work 2 or 3 jobs just to stay in the profession. And you can't bully them around. And Doug Ford had to back down. And we are seeing, some of those victories, not as many as I would like every day, but they do happen. And we're also seeing that social solidarity start to build again. So, yes, there is on the one hand, these tensions and these challenges people are having, but we're also seeing incredible displays of solidarity. Today at Queen's Park, the OPSU healthcare workers were all on the lawn together with other members of labor, and it was really great. That's the kind of thing we're seeing. The nurses and the teachers just won a really huge victory on Bill 124, and it looks like we might be at the final stages of that, and the government is going to go down with a big L on that one. So,
Was that?
yeah, so Bill 124 is the bill that capped the wages of public sector workers for the past few years at 1%, which, you know, is bad enough in normal times because it circumvents collective bargaining, but when inflation is at 8%, it's really bad. But it was declared unconstitutional by the Court of Appeal, and it was declared unconstitutional so resoundingly that the government really didn't have a leg to stand on in appealing it. They've tried anyways, but we're expecting a decision to come down soon in favor of workers. Yeah.
Could you speak about your Good Neighbor Award program?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is something that I'm excited to do. It's an idea that came from some of my New Democrat colleagues, just to recognize some of the really good work that happens within our communities, often at an unsung level. So people who are volunteers or community leaders, or who really stepped up at a moment of crisis or have implemented a really great idea. And so we put a call out for nominations across the riding to organizations and community associations, but also just to everyone. And we got a lot of really great nominations. And so next week, Friday, we're holding the ceremony, and we will be presenting the awards to the people who were nominated, including one in your midst. And
Unfortunately, I will be out of town, so I won't be
Okay.
able to attend.
it's too bad I didn't know. I could have brought your award tonight and awarded you. Yeah, but, yeah.
Ceremony.
Well, I just, it's because I snow blow my neighbor's driveway. He's an elderly gentleman and is probably 90s. And, you know, I do my driveway, I do his.
Right. Well, and you've adopted a dog and you walk it all the time, even though you're allergic and
Is this your dog, Ian?
no,
Okay.
no, my dog's.
I adopted a dog and then I took one in as a shelter dog. for
Okay.
a friend who was having some medical issues. He came for a couple of days and he stayed here. I
Yeah.
tend to, but I am not continuing on in my role.
Yes, Tom.
Is there any sense of collegiality in Queen's Park, or is it completely adversarial?
That's a very good question. There's very little collegiality between the government and opposition members, and a lot of collegiality between opposition members. But Doug Ford rules his, and Paul Calandra, they rule their caucus with an iron fist. And so conservative MPPs, they could get in trouble for, you know, even being seen being too friendly with an opposition MPP. And so there's really no hope of working directly with a few a few government members to try to appeal to their hearts and get them to change their minds.
Changing your first past the post system is part of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what it's going to take to not see this kind of government that thinks it has a mandate to run roughshod over everybody. You know, in terms of how quickly could we see it, in the last NDP platform, it was a 2 election commitment. I've been pushing for a 1 election commitment. You know, if it's in the platform and you get elected, then you move ahead with a proportional representation, and it could be like New Zealand, where you do a couple elections and then you go back to the electorate. But the Greens are very supportive of proportional representation. The Liberals are leaderless right now, and so I know some of their leadership candidates are interested. But I guess we'll have to see who ultimately is selected to lead the Liberals.
The thing I wanted to talk about, I don't think is really anything to do with the province. We have very little green space. We lost 800 trees to the RT. And we just get finger pointing between federal and municipal people on the last stretch of green that we have on our western border.
Yeah.
I think you went to the garden last
Yeah.
year, so that stretch between the bottom of the garden and Garden Avenue. I think it's very important to the future of the park. And you just can't find out anything about it. So I don't think as an MVP that have much leverage. So
Yeah, not between the municipality and the NCC.
No,
Yeah, but Tom, if there is anything I can do down the road, like, I am powerless. But if a letter of support would be helpful, then I'm happy to write that letter.
I mean, probably the most frustrating thing was when we actually went to the ombudsman, the NCC, which is copyrights. So regardless, so kids got replaced in pallets to toss a frisbee, kick a football, something.
Yeah,
The little park we have in New Orchard. It's for little kids.
yeah,
yeah, it's a Tots part.
yeah.
So. The ombudsman we had got 100 signatures just within the park. The ombudsman went back and sort of, sided with their staff, saying that's zone 3 land. And it doesn't go back. So I went to Anita Vandenberg and said, could you intervene for us? She said, no, because that would be political interference. So, it's like, what we've been doing as citizens, we have absolutely zero. And it's just, like, I cut it myself.
Yeah,
It's like, I read them more and go there and cut it.
So our
Maybe
challenge,
that's what I should do. Can you support me on that?
well, I can come and bail you out of the NCC. Watch
We are
out for it.
being recorded right now, so.
so, in the future, this neighborhood under the new city OP needs to intensify at 4 times the rate. So similar to Hintonburg. But the challenge then becomes that you're then putting high rises down Carling and you're putting a whole bunch of people on Richmond Road. So we're actually adding more people than Hintonburg.
Yeah,
So then, well, where's the public amenity space? And so one of the part that Tom didn't tell you is the NCC believes that ground birds need to be hanging out in some of that space, which I'm not sure if I've seen any ground birds. And if there were, my dog would have got them. So I'm not so sure. But it does provide a wonderful habitat for wild parsnip and thistles.
right.
And those grow plentiful and used to be considered a noxious weed.
So maybe the province can buy that way.
You don't want the province to buy it right now, though, because then it will all be high rises. Yeah.
All right, well, sorry about it.
But I mean, it's kind of like that segue, because then I get to explain that story of like, where are the people gonna go once they show up?
Yeah,
And
A statistic that I think is an important one. Is how much game places are per resident within the local distance.
yeah,
So not only have we lost green space, we intensify, so we're into orders of magnitude of mental health. Negative
And I
factors.
think
Yeah.
the new legislation puts no limit or reduces, like, there's no improvement, it's gonna get worse.
yeah,
and it makes it more difficult for you as a community association to complain about new developments.
And
Yeah.
there's no more trees I can chain this up to.
not of meaningful value. I'll start looking for them for you, buddy. We have a resident, I guess. Yeah, it's just, shall we say, the challenge, right?
Mhm.
Like, you have an established neighborhood of sorts, and then what happens when you just keep adding.
Yeah,
So, and then really our access to public space is actually federal government space. It's NCC lands, it's Mud Lake, it's Britannia.
right.
I think
But-
that even those spaces are gonna become overcrowded with the amount of.
Oh, I think Mud
Yeah.
Lake's already overcrowded some days.
Yeah, lots of turkeys.
They did a good job of reducing the human population in there.
Okay, so I think we're at a natural break, and so
All right.
I'm grateful that you were able to join us, and the more we see one another, the more we can work away on these issues, and
Yeah,
So grateful you were
absolutely.
able to join us.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and I have some magnets for your fridges.
Oh,
So
Magnus.
if you need anything that I can help you on, so not NCC land, but anything else, yeah, feel free
Well,
to.
So
Oh,
I gue-
yeah,
I
yeah.
guess the one little,
We're a couple.
the one little sales
We can
pitch.
share, Maggie.
Yeah.
We have just one fridge between us.
Oh, only one, how do you?
It's a big fridge.
Oh, okay. So. Sandra,
Other side of you? Yeah, there you go.
Sandra, one thing I would say is at some point, the city is gonna be bringing forward a proposal for phase 3 LRT.
Mhm.
And as much as, there's obviously gross problems with the implementation of phase 1 and some real challenges with phase 2. If we don't get phase 3, this thing will get worse.
Yeah,
So our neighborhood is at this crux of South Nepean and West Canada flowing through it in order to support the downtown core and
Right.
going to Quebec. So if we don't, even though I'm, shall we say, a person who really questions how much money we're spending for ridership, at the end of the day, like, they couldn't fix this in the 50s. So they're not gonna fix this in 2050.
yeah,
So then, like, how are we gonna support people being able to navigate around our community? So. That's, I mean, I just know the city's gonna make the pitch at some point.
yeah. Well, I would be supportive as long as it's not a new P3. So
Oh,
we actually get
it could be an old
an
P3.
LRT that's built somewhat on time, somewhat on budget, but at least it will work. And we will know what happened with it.
Yeah, well, I think there'll be many books written about this project, so.
Yeah.
Anyways, well,
Yeah. All
greatly
right, well,
appreciate.
thank you
your
very
time.
much for having me.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.